Marcus knew something was wrong the moment he saw the invoice for $47,000 worth of titanium screws going to a pediatric hospital in Somalia. Not because Somalia didn't deserve quality medical supplies, hell, they needed them more than anyone. But because those same screws were listed in the Department of Defense procurement database as critical aircraft components, with a unit cost of $847 each. The same screws his company, Meridian Defense Solutions, was billing the Pentagon $12,000 apiece for. It was like finding a receipt for a Ferrari in your grocery bag when you'd only bought bananas. Only the bananas were taxpayer dollars, and the Ferrari was fraud on an industrial scale. He sat in his cramped cubicle on the third floor, surrounded by the beige purgatory of corporate accounting, staring at dual monitors that displayed what could only be described as financial terrorism dressed up in Excel spreadsheets. The coffee in his world's okayest auditor mug had gone cold hours ago, but his blood was running hot enough to power a small city. Look, before we dive deeper, quick reality check. If you're reading this and thinking, this sounds too crazy to be true, well, buckle up. Because what I'm about to tell you about defense contracting fraud would make your average mob accountant weep with envy. And if you haven't hit that follow button yet, come on. Stories like this don't write themselves, and neither does my rent. One click keeps the exposés rolling. Anyway, back to the $47,000 titanium screws that started it all. Marcus worked at Meridian Defense Solutions, a mid-tier defense contractor that specialized in what they called critical military hardware procurement. Which really meant they bought stuff from manufacturers, slapped a 2,000% markup on it, and sold it to the Pentagon while invoking national security every time someone asked questions. It was like playing telephone with taxpayer dollars, except every person in the chain got to whisper, "Ka-ching," before passing the message along. His official title was Senior Financial Analyst, but what he really did was follow paper trails that led nowhere good. He'd been there for 6 years, long enough to know that the company's patriotic rhetoric was just window dressing on a machine designed to extract maximum profit from minimum effort. But he'd never seen anything quite like this. The Somalia invoice was sitting in a folder labeled Humanitarian Aid Logistics, which sounded noble until you realized it was filed under the same project code as Operation Fortress Shield, a classified Pentagon initiative that supposedly involved cutting-edge aircraft maintenance protocols. Marcus clicked through the procurement records, cross-referencing part numbers, suppliers, and delivery addresses. The pattern that emerged made his stomach turn inside out. The same components were being sold to 3 different buyers: the Department of Defense at premium prices, allied governments at moderate prices, and humanitarian organizations at cost. But here's the kicker: they were all the same parts, from the same batch, manufactured by the same supplier. It was like selling the same car to 3 different people, telling the first guy it was a limited edition Ferrari, the second guy it was a reliable Honda, and the third guy it was a donated food truck. Except instead of cars, it was military equipment. And instead of 3 random buyers, it was the United States government getting financially sodomized by its own contractor. Marcus spent the next 4 hours building a spreadsheet that would have made forensic accountants weep with joy. Part numbers, invoice amounts, delivery dates, everything cross-referenced and color-coded like a rainbow of corporate malfeasance. By 11:30 p.m., he had documented what appeared to be a systematic scheme to defraud the Pentagon of approximately $23 million over the past 18 months. The office was empty except for the security guard who occasionally wandered past his cubicle, probably wondering why someone was still there entering numbers into Excel like their life depended on it. Maybe it did. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something explosive, something that could blow up more than just his career. He saved everything to an encrypted drive, backed it up to a secure cloud account, and printed hard copies of the most damning evidence. Not because he was paranoid, but because he'd seen enough corporate scandals to know that digital evidence had a funny way of disappearing when convenient. The next morning, Marcus walked into his supervisor's office with a manila folder that felt heavier than it should have. Janet Reeves was a woman who'd turned middle management into an art form, complete with motivational posters and a coffee mug that said, "Chaos Coordinator." She was also the person who'd have to decide whether to escalate his findings or bury them. "Janet, I need to show you something," Marcus said, setting the folder on her desk. "I found what appears to be systematic billing fraud involving our Pentagon contracts." Janet opened the folder, glanced at the first page, and immediately closed it like she'd just opened a box of live snakes. Marcus, this looks like a lot of speculation based on incomplete data. It's not speculation. Those are invoice records showing identical components being sold at different prices to different buyers under the same project codes. She pushed the folder back toward him. Look, I appreciate your thoroughness, but we need to be careful about making accusations without full context. These contracts are complex, and there are often legitimate reasons for price variations. A 1,400% markup isn't a price variation, Janet. It's theft. Her smile turned into the kind of expression you'd see on someone trying to explain why jumping off a cliff wasn't a good idea. Marcus, I'm going to need you to step back from this. These contracts go through multiple levels of approval, including legal review. If there were problems, they would have been caught. Unless the people doing the approving are the same people profiting from the fraud. The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Janet's jaw tightened. I'm going to pretend you didn't just imply that our executives are criminals. Take the rest of the day to think about whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem. Marcus left her office knowing he'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He spent the rest of the day researching whistleblower protection laws and trying to decide whether his conscience was worth his paycheck. By 5 p.m., he had his answer. The next morning, Marcus bypassed Janet entirely and sent an email directly to the company's ethics hotline, which was supposedly an independent third-party service designed to handle exactly these kinds of reports. The email was clinical, professional, and loaded with enough evidence to sink a battleship. The response came back 3 hours later. Thank you for your concern. Your report has been reviewed and determined to be outside the scope of actionable ethics violations. Please direct any operational questions to your immediate supervisor. Outside the scope. $23 million in what appeared to be systematic fraud was apparently a minor operational question. That's when Marcus realized the ethics hotline wasn't independent. It was about as independent as a ventriloquist's dummy, and the hand up its ass belonged to Meridian Defense Solutions. So he did what any reasonable person would do when faced with institutional corruption. He called the FBI. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has a public corruption unit that specializes in defense contractor fraud. Marcus had looked it up during his lunch break, sitting in his car in the parking lot, eating a sandwich that tasted like cardboard and moral outrage. The phone number was right there on their website, like they were expecting his call. Agent Sarah Chen answered on the third ring. Her voice was professional, patient, and completely lacking in the dismissive tone he'd grown accustomed to at work. Agent Chen, this is Marcus Rivera. I work for a defense contractor called Meridian Defense Solutions, and I believe I've uncovered evidence of systematic fraud involving Pentagon contracts. Mr. Rivera, I'm going to need you to be very specific about what you've found. Marcus spent the next 20 minutes walking her through the evidence, the invoices, the price discrepancies, the pattern of billing. Agent Chen asked detailed questions, took notes, and didn't once suggest that he was misunderstanding complex business practices. Mr. Rivera, what you're describing sounds like potential violations of the False Claims Act, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Are you willing to provide this evidence to federal investigators? Yes, ma'am. I have documentation, electronic records, and hard copies of everything. I'm going to connect you with our white-collar crime division. They'll want to meet with you as soon as possible. And Mr. Rivera, don't discuss this with anyone at your company. Don't email about it, don't mention it to colleagues, and definitely don't try to gather additional evidence on your own. Just go to work, act normal, and wait for our call. Marcus hung up feeling like he'd just pulled the pin on a grenade. There was no going back now. He'd crossed from concerned employee to federal informant in the span of a 20-minute phone call. The meeting with the FBI happened 3 days later in a nondescript office building downtown. Agent Chen was there, along with Agent Rodriguez from the White-Collar Crime Division and a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office who looked like she'd been personally insulted by every fraudulent invoice Marcus had uncovered. They went through everything. Every invoice, every price discrepancy, every pattern of billing that suggested intentional deception. Marcus had organized it all chronologically, with supporting documentation and a summary that read like a prosecutor's dream and a defense contractor's nightmare. Mr. Rivera, the prosecutor said, this is some of the most comprehensive documentation we've seen in a case like this. You've essentially built our entire case file for us. I just want to make sure the right people see this information. Agent Rodriguez leaned forward. We're going to need you to continue working at Meridian while we investigate. Can you do that without arousing suspicion? Marcus nodded, though the idea of walking back into that office knowing what he knew made his skin crawl. How long do you think the investigation will take? These things move fast once we have solid evidence. Probably a few weeks, maybe less. It was Agent Chen who delivered the final instruction. Mr. Rivera, once we start moving on this, things are going to happen very quickly. Your company will likely figure out that someone provided information to federal investigators. Are you prepared for that possibility? Marcus thought about Janet's dismissive smile, about the ethics hotline that was apparently a direct line to nowhere, about $23 million in taxpayer dollars being funneled into executive bonus pools. I'm prepared. What he wasn't prepared for was how quickly his life would implode. The call came on a Tuesday morning at 9:47 a.m. Marcus was at his desk, pretending to work on quarterly budget reconciliations while actually researching apartment rentals in other cities, just in case he needed to disappear for a while. His phone rang, and Janet's name appeared on the screen. Marcus, I need you in my office immediately. The tone was different, not dismissive, not condescending. Cold, final. Marcus walked into Janet's office to find her sitting behind her desk with two other people, Richard Hawthorne, the company's head of legal, and Diana Foster, the HR director who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Marcus, please sit down, Janet said. We need to discuss some concerning allegations that have come to our attention. His blood pressure spiked. What kind of allegations? Richard Hawthorne opened a folder and pulled out a document. We've received information suggesting that you've been making false and defamatory statements about Meridian Defense Solutions to outside parties. Specifically, allegations of improper billing practices. Marcus felt like he was watching himself from outside his body. I reported legitimate concerns about financial irregularities through proper channels. No, Diana Foster interjected, you made unsubstantiated accusations of criminal activity to federal law enforcement without following company protocol or attempting to verify your assumptions through appropriate channels. I did follow company protocol. I reported to my supervisor and to the ethics hotline. Both were ignored. Janet shook her head. Marcus, we've reviewed your concerns, and they're based on fundamental misunderstandings of how defense contracting works. These pricing structures are standard industry practice, approved by legal, and fully compliant with all applicable regulations. $23 million in inflated billing is standard practice. The room went silent. Richard Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. Mr. Rivera, how exactly did you arrive at that figure? Marcus realized he'd just stepped into a trap. There was no way he could have calculated that number from the information available to him through normal channels. He'd have to have been digging through files, cross-referencing databases, and conducting his own unauthorized investigation. I analyzed the billing records available to me as part of my job responsibilities. Your job responsibilities, Diana Foster said, do not include investigating company operations or making accusations of criminal activity. Your job responsibilities definitely do not include contacting federal law enforcement to report unsubstantiated allegations. Richard Hawthorne leaned forward. Mr. Rivera, we know you've been in contact with the FBI. We know you've provided them with proprietary company information. We know you've made allegations that could damage Meridian's reputation and jeopardize our relationships with government clients. Marcus's mouth went dry. How do you know that? Because we have lawyers, Marcus. And those lawyers have relationships with people who tell them when their clients are being investigated. The room spun slightly. Marcus gripped the arms of his chair. Are you saying you've been monitoring federal investigations? We're saying we protect our interests, Janet said. And right now, you're a threat to those interests. Diana Foster opened her own folder and pulled out a termination letter. Effective immediately, your employment with Meridian Defense Solutions is terminated for cause. Specifically, unauthorized disclosure of proprietary information, insubordination, and conduct detrimental to the company's interests. Marcus stared at the letter. You're firing me for reporting fraud. We're firing you for violating your employment agreement and company policy, Richard Hawthorne said. Your severance package is contingent on signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a statement acknowledging that your allegations were unfounded. I'm not signing anything. Then you're not getting severance. Marcus stood up, his legs shaky but his voice steady. I'm not signing anything because everything I reported is true. And you know it's true. That's why you're firing me. Janet's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that looked like genuine regret. Marcus, you're a good analyst. You could have had a future here. Don't throw it all away for some misguided sense of righteousness. My misguided sense of righteousness is the only thing in this room that isn't for sale. He walked out without signing anything, without shaking hands, without looking back. The security guard was waiting by his desk with a cardboard box. His personal belongings fit inside with room to spare, a coffee mug, a desk plant that was probably dead anyway, and a framed photo of his daughter that suddenly seemed like the most important thing in the world. As he was escorted to the elevator, Marcus caught a glimpse of his co-workers pretending not to watch. Some looked curious, others looked relieved that the drama was happening to someone else. None of them looked surprised. The elevator doors closed, and Marcus descended from the third floor of Meridian Defense Solutions for the last time. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to become the most vindicated unemployed person in the history of defense contractor fraud. The next 18 hours were a blur of self-doubt, cheap wine, and obsessive news refreshing. Marcus sat in his living room, laptop open, waiting for something. He didn't know what, exactly. Maybe a phone call from Agent Chen. Maybe a news report about a major investigation. Maybe just some sign that he'd done the right thing. His phone buzzed at 11:30 p.m. Unknown number. Mr. Rivera, this is Agent Chen. I wanted to let you know that we've accelerated our timeline. We're moving tomorrow morning. Marcus sat up straight. Moving how? Search warrants. We're executing simultaneous searches of Meridian's offices, several executive residences, and the primary data center. We wanted to give you a heads up because things are about to get very public very quickly. Are you arresting anyone? That depends on what we find, but based on your documentation, I'd say it's likely. Mr. Rivera, I want you to know that your cooperation has been invaluable. The evidence you provided gave us everything we needed to get the warrants. Marcus felt a strange mix of vindication and terror. What happens now? Now you stay away from Meridian Defense Solutions and let us do our job. And Mr. Rivera, you might want to keep your phone handy. The media is probably going to want to talk to you. The call ended, and Marcus sat in his dark living room, staring at his phone. In less than 12 hours, the company that had fired him for whistleblowing was about to be raided by federal agents. The same executives who had dismissed his concerns as misunderstandings were about to have their offices searched by the FBI. He poured himself another glass of wine and raised it in a toast to no one in particular. Here's to misguided righteousness. The first news alert came at 6:23 a.m. FBI raids defense contractor offices in fraud investigation. Marcus was already awake, had been since 4 a.m., drinking coffee and obsessively checking news sites. His phone had been buzzing with notifications for the past hour. By 7 a.m., the story was everywhere. Major defense contractor under federal investigation for billing fraud. FBI executes search warrants at Meridian Defense Solutions. Pentagon contracts under scrutiny in federal probe. Marcus's phone rang. Agent Chen's number. Mr. Rivera, I wanted to update you on this morning's operation. We've executed searches at 17 locations, including all of Meridian's primary facilities. We've also taken several individuals into custody for questioning. Anyone I know. I can't discuss specifics, but I can tell you that the individuals include senior executives and members of the legal team. Marcus felt a cold satisfaction spread through his chest. What about the billing records? We've seized their entire financial database, along with correspondence between executives that appears to corroborate your allegations. Mr. Rivera, without your initial report, we never would have known to look for this. You've potentially saved taxpayers millions of dollars. After the call ended, Marcus sat in his kitchen, staring at the news coverage on his laptop. There was footage of FBI agents carrying boxes out of the Meridian building. The same building where he'd worked for 6 years, where he'd been escorted out less than 24 hours ago. His phone rang again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Rivera, this is Jessica Martinez from Channel 7 News. We understand you may have information about the FBI investigation into Meridian Defense Solutions. Would you be willing to speak with us? Marcus hesitated. Agent Chen had warned him that the media would be interested, but he hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. I'm not sure I should comment while there's an ongoing investigation. Mr. Rivera, we have sources telling us that you were terminated from Meridian yesterday after reporting concerns about billing irregularities. Is that accurate? Marcus felt his stomach drop. Where did you hear that? We have multiple sources confirming that you were a whistleblower in this case. Mr. Rivera, your story is going to come out whether you participate or not. Wouldn't you prefer to tell it yourself? Marcus thought about Janet's condescending smile, about the ethics hotline that went nowhere, about $23 million in taxpayer money being funneled into executive bank accounts. What do you want to know? The interview aired that evening. Marcus sat in his living room, watching himself on television, talking about financial irregularities and corporate cover-ups. He looked nervous, which he had been, but his voice was steady as he explained how he'd uncovered the billing fraud and how the company had fired him for reporting it. Mr. Rivera, the reporter had asked, what do you say to critics who might argue that you violated your employment agreement by going to federal authorities? I'd say that my employment agreement didn't include staying silent about potential crimes. And I'd say that $23 million in taxpayer money is more important than my job security. The story exploded overnight. By morning, it was national news. Defense contractor whistleblower speaks out after FBI raid. Fired employees fraud report leads to federal investigation. The whistleblower who exposed Pentagon billing scandal. Marcus's phone didn't stop ringing. Reporters, producers, attorneys, advocacy groups. Everyone wanted to talk to the man who'd brought down a major defense contractor by following a paper trail that led to one of the biggest fraud schemes in recent Pentagon history. 3 days later, the arrests came. Richard Hawthorne, the head of legal who'd accused Marcus of making unsubstantiated allegations, was charged with conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Janet Reeves, his former supervisor who'd told him to step back from his concerns, was charged with obstruction of justice. The CEO, who Marcus had never met but who'd signed off on the fraudulent contracts, was charged with wire fraud and money laundering. The indictments read like a prosecutor's fever dream: systematic billing fraud, falsified invoices, conspiracy to defraud the Pentagon, obstruction of federal investigations. Everything Marcus had documented, everything he'd reported, everything he'd been fired for reporting. Agent Chen called him with the news. Mr. Rivera, I wanted to let you know that we've secured indictments against 7 individuals, including the senior executives you dealt with. The total amount of fraud we've documented is actually higher than your initial estimate. We're looking at approximately $37 million in fraudulent billing over the past 2 years. Marcus felt dizzy. $37 million. Your initial report was just the tip of the iceberg. Once we started digging, we found that the Somalia invoices were part of a much larger scheme. They were systematically overbilling the Pentagon while underselling the same equipment to other buyers. What happens now? Now they go to trial. And Mr. Rivera, you're going to be our star witness. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Marcus testified for 2 days, walking the jury through the invoices, the billing records, the pattern of fraud that had first caught his attention. He explained how he'd reported his concerns through proper channels, how those concerns had been dismissed, and how he'd ultimately contacted federal authorities. The defense attorneys tried to paint him as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but the evidence was overwhelming. The fraudulent invoices spoke for themselves. The executive emails discussing how to hide the billing irregularities spoke for themselves. The pattern of systematic deception spoke for itself. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. All 7 defendants were convicted on all charges. Richard Hawthorne got 12 years in federal prison. Janet Reeves got 8 years. The CEO got 15 years and was ordered to pay $37 million in restitution. Marcus sat in the courtroom as the verdicts were read, watching the people who'd fired him for making unsubstantiated allegations being led away in handcuffs. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like justice. After the trial, Marcus was contacted by a law firm specializing in whistleblower cases. Under the False Claims Act, whistleblowers who report fraud against the government are entitled to a percentage of the recovered funds. Marcus's percentage of $37 million was substantial enough that he'd never have to work again if he didn't want to. But he did want to work. He wanted to keep following paper trails, keep asking uncomfortable questions, keep holding powerful people accountable. He just wanted to do it for people who wouldn't fire him for doing his job. 6 months later, Marcus started his own consulting firm specializing in financial forensics and fraud investigation. His first client was a small defense contractor that wanted to make sure their billing practices were clean. His second client was a whistleblower who'd uncovered irregularities at a major aerospace company. The business grew quickly. Apparently, there was a lot of demand for someone who knew how to spot financial fraud and wasn't afraid to report it. Marcus kept the newspaper clipping from the day of the FBI raid framed on his office wall. Not because he was proud of bringing down his former employer, but because he wanted to remember what it felt like to be fired for doing the right thing. He wanted to remember that feeling so he'd never let anyone else experience it alone. The inscription at the bottom read, "Sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do. But it's always the right thing to do." Below that, in smaller print, Meridian Defense Solutions, 7 convictions, $37 million in fraud, 0 lessons learned by other companies doing the same thing. Marcus smiled every time he read it. There was always more work to do. Epilogue. 2 years later, Marcus received a call from Agent Chen. She was calling to let him know that their investigation into Meridian Defense Solutions had led to a broader probe of defense contractor billing practices. So far, they'd identified similar fraud schemes at 12 other companies, with total losses to taxpayers exceeding $200 million. Mr. Rivera, that invoice you noticed for $47,000 in titanium screws. That single invoice has led to the largest defense contractor fraud investigation in FBI history. Marcus laughed. All because someone was selling the same screws to 3 different buyers at 3 different prices. All because someone was paying attention and had the courage to speak up. Marcus hung up and looked out the window of his office. In the distance, he could see the building where Meridian Defense Solutions used to be located. It was empty now, with a "For Lease" sign in the window. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything. Sometimes it gives you everything. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, it gives you the chance to help other people do the right thing too. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed the number for his next client, another whistleblower who'd found something that didn't add up. Another person who'd noticed that the numbers didn't match, that the invoices didn't make sense, that someone was stealing from the people who deserved better. "This is Marcus Rivera," he said when the call connected. "I understand you've found something that doesn't add up. Let's talk about what we can do to fix it." Because in the end, that's what it was all about. Not the money, not the vindication, not even the justice. It was about fixing things that were broken, one fraudulent invoice at a time. And there were always more invoices to check.